They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, he immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them.
So let's hear it for Christian, who said all those really great words. When I called Tracy and I said, "We've got one of our kids that are going to read for us today," she was like, "Oh, thank you." So yeah, thank you, Christian. It's great. And by the way, Chris Hake, who was here doing the violin, I think he just slipped out. Amazing, right? And you guys, thank you so much for the music. So Paul is on a journey, and he goes to all these places. Now, if you actually map these journeys, you don't see a straight line. What you see is a bunch of zigzagging. And you get to a place and then find out you're not allowed to be there, so you have to turn around and go somewhere else. So vacation planning with Paul is not really a fun thing to do, right? Because nobody knows exactly where you're going to go, how long you're going to stay, or when you're going to come away from it. But that's the thing, is Paul's not in it for the vacation or the fun. Paul's in it to tell the good news. Paul's in it because God has been calling Paul out to speak the good news. So it's the voice of the Spirit that Paul is listening to that helps direct where he goes. And oftentimes he doesn't hear that voice of whether or not he shouldn't go until after he's already there. So he has to change directions and go a different place. That whole listening to the Spirit thing is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But that's what Paul is called to be about here, and that's what Paul is doing. It doesn't take a straight line to get to where you're going, but he follows anyway. And that listening to the Spirit, that's a gift that Paul gives to the first century Christians that we can learn from, because that practice of listening to the Spirit is equally as important as the message that he gives about Jesus Christ in that good news message. So how we hear the good news through Paul, through each other, is that listening. And that's what we're talking about today as part of our continued series where we've spoken a little bit about dreaming big dreams and hovering over those dreams for a while just to see how they sit with us, see if we can try them on and feel good in those dreams. And then maybe risking a couple of things, like some presuppositions that we have or some assumptions that we bring with us into the world in order to try something new. That's risking. And today we're talking about listening. Opening yourself up to that voice that surrounds us all the time, that's within us all the time, and that surrounds us in the people that we talk to and with. Listening is quite the practice of opening ourselves up to see if there's maybe something else going on in the world around us. Eric spoke to this idea of listening and of having the Spirit help guide our steps, knowing that it's not necessarily a straight line, but a zigzag pattern. He says the difference between a life path that takes us somewhere and one that goes nowhere often has little to do with a failure to dream, hover, or risk, but a failure to listen once we found our path and began walking it. The path is never a straight line. You will almost always stray from it if you assume that you can move straight from point A to point B. And Paul's travels actually confirm that idea, that there really is no straight line when you're listening to the Spirit. It's that whole communication thing with one another, that as we bounce against one another, all new discoveries happen, and you never know where it's going to take you. So last week I introduced Margaret Wheatley into the same conversation that we're having on this process with Troy Bronzink in our Drawn In series. Margaret Wheatley is an organizational theorist who is going to be our Center for Faith Study speaker this weekend. She draws from natural science, from quantum physics and a bunch of other sciences in order to look at how the life of the world actually self-organizes in ways to find patterns that might be able to help us in our own organizational structures. How can we learn from nature to move with the flow of things rather than to fight against it? How can we talk about relational dynamics rather than mechanical dynamics? Those are the kinds of things that Margaret Wheatley brings to us, and she's astounding. And how that relates to us in our world and our ministry is incredibly vibrant. So I encourage all of you to come this weekend if you possibly can and listen to how she speaks to us. In a book she wrote early on in her career called Leadership in the New Science, she looked at quantum physics, and she talked about chaos theory in the midst of quantum physics. What appears, first of all, to be really random, like all the places that Paul was going to on that map. It looks really random, that kind of thing, but it's a pattern because for Paul, he's being guided by the Spirit. And in science, it confirms the same kind of thing. This chaos theory idea that she has is that things that look most random in and of itself at first glance actually have a pattern to them. And so we're going to talk about that chaos theory, the emergence theory, all the things that go into shaping those patterns in our lives when we least expect them or can possibly see them. But perhaps when we're listening, we can be directed by them. Wheatley talks about this way. She says, when we concentrate on individual moments or fragments of experience, we see only chaos. But if we stand back and look at what is taking shape, we see order. Order always displays itself as patterns that develop over time. So when you're looking at something at first glance and it appears absolutely random, consider the fact that over time, there might be something more to it, and you should be paying a little bit more attention to it. Chaos theory proves this point by showing you things. In that first picture on the left, you see 5 separate points that are drawn together by lines. Those points by themselves without the lines look incredibly random. Even with the lines, they look incredibly random. But with computers, you can take that system evolution of those 5 lines and be able to speed it up over and over and over again into reintegration or reiteration of events. And as that happens, that one pattern begins to repeat itself. And it happens so fast over computers that you couldn't possibly see it in your own life and in your own time schedule. This takes sometimes eons for this stuff to happen. But because computers can speed it all up, we can see the patterns start to form. Those random spots turn into the leaf of a fern when you reiterate them like that. Isn't that astounding? I think that's astounding. That's chaos theory, the idea that what appears to be random at first glance, actually, when you step back and given time, could develop patterns that help shape who we are and how we participate with one another in the world. The thing in the very center that helps that pattern emerge is what Wheatley calls the strange attractor, that picture that emerges out of what seems to be random. And she talks about it this way. The system careens back and forth with raucous unpredictability, never showing up in the same spot twice. But as we watch, this chaotic behavior weaves into a pattern, and before our eyes, order emerges on the screen. That's a picture of a strange attractor. Here's another one. The chaotic movements of the system have formed themselves into a shape. The shape is a strange attractor. And what has appeared on the screen is the order that is inherent in chaos. There is order in chaos. Believable? Yes. Quantum physics helps us think about these things in relationship to one another. It's not just a system of mechanical, everything adds up to the sum of its parts. It's rather how, when things bump into each other, does something else new emerge? These strange attractors give us these ideas. And Margaret Wheatley would say that the strange attractor in our otherwise very random life is that idea of meaning. All of us are drawn together by this idea of meaning and purpose in the world. We're seeking it. We're searching for it. We're talking to each other about it. We're trying to live into it. And that idea of meaning is something that can draw us in and keep us in that centered line focus, so that all the chaos that around us actually patterns itself into a shape, into a form, into a purpose that we can step out into and participate with the rest of life, the rest of creation. Now, Paul and his travelers knew this. Their strange attractor is the love of God, their identity in the love of God, that calling that they had to pursue their conversations with people in places that they had never been to before, in order to have new voices to listen to draw new possibilities from, to step into life in a brand new way. This is what Paul was doing, that we can learn from. That gift of listening to the Spirit in order to have a new way of interpreting what we think we already know, and shaping those patterns in a new way that will draw us out of ourselves into something altogether new, all done by the grace of God. So how are we listening to each other? How are we listening to God? In our day, in our time, taking that same gift that Paul gave to the first century Christians in listening to one another and taking new steps forward. The Eden Tree Initiative that Eric introduced a couple weeks ago is his first step in that direction. Now that we're here at the Tri-Faith, we have time to reconsider who we are, to reconsider the context in which we find ourselves, to listen to all the new voices that have come into our community since we've been here, and have a whole new conversation that might take us to someplace completely different than where we thought we were going when we left 8787 Pacific. This is what emergence and conversation and chaos therein, randomness leads to, is this conversation where we can share all of our voices together. And this one happens to be around the center of how do we work with our youth and our young adults in order to do the ministry of Christ in the world. And not only to listen to our voices, but to listen to the voices of the youth who also bring us the message of Christ, right? All of us have a message to share. And it's through listening to everyone that those voices merge and bump against each other and give us brand new possibilities to think in new ways. That's what this is all about. Besides which, so I would encourage you to come to this conversation. The first one is Sunday, December 8th at 12:30. And if nothing else, it's free pizza. And everybody knows that that's why you come to meetings, is because it's free food.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we see, oh, I won't be afraid, no, I won't be afraid, just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Stand by me. If the sky that we look upon should tumble and fall, and the mountains should crumble into the sea, I won't cry, no, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me. Oh, stand by me.
Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands.
Intentionally listening to the Spirit in our lives leads us to places completely unknown. We don't know where it's going. But this love, this unconditional love of God for us, that we are loved beyond our wildest imaginations, is that center point that grounds us so that we can spin around and try all kinds of new things in order to establish new patterns and move in different ways out into the world. That love is that strange attractor, that thing that centers us. And this centering is exactly what Václav Havel is speaking to in this quote that we had today. Václav Havel was the last president of Czechoslovakia before it was split and became part of the Czech Republic. So hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. We don't have to know the outcome of something before we go into it in order to try it. That's what hope is all about. That's what faith is all about. That's what grace is all about. Stepping out into the unknown without knowing for certainty how what you're attempting to accomplish is going to turn out. Parker Palmer talks about this in a similar way. He talks about how oftentimes we only go after those projects that we know for certain that we can accomplish. And because we do that, we don't always take risks on other projects that we could be doing that might have a much greater outcome for us, a much greater sense of joy about it, and we settle for the things that we think we know we can accomplish. And by doing that, we've limited ourselves, we've limited God into the world, and we're not helping the world move to the place where God is trying to get it. We are co-creators with God. If we limit our projects only to those things that we know the outcome of, then we might be missing out on quite a bit. And where is God moving in the midst of that? How are we following God's love into the world? How are we trusting God to find something altogether new in a place where we're pushed into those places we would not normally go on our own, right? So the what ifs of life is what Parker Palmer encourages us to be about. And for Margaret Wheatley, this whole idea of something coming out of our conversations with one another, something altogether new, maybe a new interpretation, maybe a new vision, maybe a new insight into something else, that is called emergence. In the social science world, in the quantum physics world, the emergence is the rising of something that comes out of other parts that could not be predicted. Emergence is exactly that thing that she says is a process whereby interactions create something new and different that cannot be changed. Once something has emerged, it is here to stay. The only way to create something different is to start over again, to begin again. Emergence demands a different type of relationship with life, where we're curious, open, and alert. The only thing we can predict is that life will surprise us. We can't see what it's coming until it arrives. And once something has emerged, we have to work with what is. This is that listening to the Spirit, not knowing the outcome. Emergence is relational. It's not something that you can take this part and this part and this part and this part and know something about all those parts and then be able to predict what those parts come to in a totality. It's something altogether different. that emerges from our bumping into one another, being in conversation with one another, listening to each other and to God's voice in the midst of that conversation. And what's here then is here to stay. Even if we couldn't predict it, we have to deal with it. We have to relate to it. And then that draws us out into a new way of life, risking things that we thought we already knew and stepping into places that we wouldn't have otherwise, just to see what will happen. It's a discovery process. And we're not in it alone. We're in it with one another, and God is in it with us. So emergence is not necessarily a scary thing. It's a possibility. It's a new chance to try something altogether different and see how it fits. It's life evolving in the midst of our conversations. Relational is what listening is all about. We have to face with each other. We have to talk to one another, greeting each other as the child of God that is the person standing in front of me, as well as me being that child of God. And with that comes all new possibility. Every new voice has a new possibility in the midst of it. That's what relational listening is all about, bringing us together. This is hope. This is that conversation that Václav Havel is talking about. This kind of relational hope, and this is Sharon Royers, by the way. She's here with us today. She was on vacation in New York, and she took this picture, and I asked her if I could use it from her vacation because I think it's a beautiful picture. Thank you, Sharon. Hope is that thing that, you will draw from in order to step out into something else. You're hoping for something different. You're anticipating something different. So you use hope for that way to maybe draw you out of yourself and imagine something altogether different. The other side of hope, the back side of hope, is that you use it to ignore what's actually happened as an escape out of what the situation is that you currently find yourself in, that context that you find yourself in. So when Margaret Wheatley talks in her newest book, Who Do We Choose to Be?, she talks about civilizations and how civilizations evolve. And she talks specifically about the civilization that we're in right now. There have been several civilizations that have come and gone in the history of the world. And the one that we're in right now, she would say, watching the patterns of the collapse of other civilizations, she's able to see the patterns that other people are drawing who study social sciences. And she would say that we are in the midst of a civilization collapse. And not only are we in the midst of a civilization collapse, but we are in the final stages of that collapse, which means there's absolutely nothing we can do about changing that pattern. It's inevitable, it will happen, and we cannot change it. There's hope for you. So what do you think her advice is in that? In the midst of a collapse that we cannot stop from happening, what's her advice for us? Talk to one another. That's a good one. She says, give up hope. Give up hope. Because that backside of hope is that thing that you use to ignore the situation you're in. You use it as an escape to not deal with the reality that you're seeing. And what she says is you cannot look at the situation that we're in right now and try to save it. You can't rescue it. You need to concentrate your efforts not on the hope that something will come along to save it, but rather how do you turn to one another in a way that you bring compassion and care to one another in the inevitable transition. There is life on the other side of collapse. We've had collapses throughout civilizations over and over and over again. The collapse is not the calamity. The calamity would be that you ignore it and you don't figure out a way how you can live through it together and what the possibilities might be on the other side of it. This collapse doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be a positive thing that moves us into a brand new way of being in the world. A way of being that God calls us to if we only talk to one another. So instead of concentrating our efforts on rescue, we should concentrate on efforts on those things that put people in the very center of the conversation. Not our national identity, not our politics, not our religious denominations. Those aren't the things we're trying to save. We're trying to be in relationship with one another. We're trying to save who we are together as a species, as a community, as children of God. How is God helping us walk us through this shift, through this transition? We all see it coming. For the last 50 years, everyone's been telling me, we're in the midst of a shift. We're in the midst of a shift. Something's changing. Everything's happening. Phyllis Tickle says every 500 years we have this huge garage sale, and we get rid of all the stuff we don't need anymore. And we hang on to those things that are treasures, and we move forward in a new way. This has happened over and over again. It's not new. It doesn't have to be scary. We need to see it with some clarity. We need to step out, risking who we are in the midst of it, and turning to one another in conversation. Because that is the good side of hope. That's the point where we come together and we start new things, like the Tri-Faith. Where we come together and we start new things like concentrating on our youth and how we can maybe have a different kind of ministry together in the midst of this Tri-Faith that is altogether different, that builds strong characters and strong singers in our youth, right? That are then strong conversation partners with us in our conversations. That's what this is all about. The good news is that in the midst of all this, we are not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of millions of people and creation that has gone on before us that help show us the way, that lend their voices and their love and their support to us as we shift through this transition. Suddenly all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say, watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. This is not new. It doesn't need to be scary. We need to turn to one another. Margaret Wheatley says we need to build warriors for the human spirit. That's what this workshop is all about. How can we come together sharing God's love as our center and be able to spin out brand new possibilities from that? We are not alone. That gives me hope. In this meal, which was a serious collapse, right? On the night in which he was betrayed, he broke bread and gave it to his disciples and said, the world is not going to be the same, but take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This love is that centered, strange attractor that grounds us all. And again, after supper, he takes the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to all to drink, saying, this cup is a new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people. A new way to interpret the world. A new vision for the world in the midst of chaos. This is God's love, spinning out in all directions. You are invited to participate in this meal. You do not need to be a member of this congregation. You don't have to believe in anything I just said. You don't have to believe in anything we've ever said. You have to be able to listen to God's voice calling you forward. And if that happens, we'd love to have you join us with us. This is a meal that you can take a part of the bread and dip it in either the juice or the wine, whichever you prefer. They're clearly marked here. And as you take it in, you realize that you are part of what God is already doing that makes things new all around us. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. I invite our servers to come forward to prepare the meal. And as they're coming forward, let us say together our identity as a community of Christ. We are an inclusive, open, and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We care for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world. Please come, the table is ready.